On today's episode of the 2020 Awards podcast, we have Conversations with Murph. Not to be confused with the book Conversations with Murch. Our guest today is editor Tracy Dethlefs, whose nickname is Murph. So we're gonna call you Murph today. Making his way up and down the West Coast, Murph has been involved in creating commercials, films, and television series for MTV, PBS, Comedy Central, and the BBC. Highlight of his career is editing a music video for Weird Al Yankovic, who slept on his couch. So we're gonna find out if Weird Al snores. Murph presented the award for the best editor at the 3rd annual 2020 Awards, and he had a wonderful description of what an editor does, and you can find that on the 2020 Awards website. So welcome back to the show, Murph.
Absolutely a pleasure.
Does Weird Al snore?
He does not snore, but I got to tell you, the couch was about, it was almost like a love seat, and Weird Al's a big guy. He's a very, very tall guy. The funniest thing about Weird Al is that when you take a picture with him, he puts on the Weird Al face, and he's just like crazy, rah, rah, kind of clown face. But then most of the other time, he's deadly serious Al. He's deadly
serious Al.
Coming this fall to Fox, Deadly Serious Al, starring Weird Al Yankovic. Yeah, he's amazingly focused and very, very smart. One of the smartest creative guys I've ever worked with. And this video, if you ever get a chance to see it, if you guys want to look it up, is Mixed Up Son of a Bitch by the President of the United States. And it is crazy.
It's a cool video.
Yeah,
I really like it.
Yeah, he had every thought just completely planned out. It was one of those things working with somebody with a real vision. It was a gift to have that chance. But yeah, not to my knowledge, he does not snore. So yeah.
Does he raid the fridge at night?
I think our yogurt supply was fine. I think he didn't take too many activities.
It wasn't depleted when he woke up. So, as I mentioned, when you accepted the 2020 award for the editing team on Terminator 2, you described the role of an editor to be very similar to that of a Terminator robot, which I thought was fantastic. Could you elaborate on this?
If I recall, it was basically protecting a teenager who was prophesized to save the world.
Right.
Something to that effect.
Yeah. That an editor's job is really to protect the director in the same way. And I think you said something about protecting that frame. Yeah,
so that idea, I have this concept, and this isn't always, in play. Sometimes the editor does need to be on set for, green screen work or to see if some certain effects are going to work. But a big thing for the editor is that the editor is the last line of defense between the film and the audience. He basically has to see the film in fresh eyes. And one way that he can do that is not coming to the set and not seeing maybe how long it took to set up a certain shot, or there may be something where the director, and this has happened, where the director is just convinced that this one take was absolutely hilarious, but then it works out that somebody told a joke right before they started yelling action, and there was a good mood on the set, but the take wasn't that focused or something. And so there are biases that come from production. There are biases that come from pre-production and the writing and so on. And the editor has to come to it without biases and has to look at it the way that the audience might see it. And remember that basically all that, the way I always say is what's in that box is all that matters. What is in that frame is all that matters, because if it's not in my system, and there's not a plan for getting some visual effects shot or some stock footage or something, it doesn't exist. And the audience doesn't know about it unless you create a way for them to know about it. So if you're thinking that as the director or the writer, that, this is completely clear, it's got to be clear to me as the editor first.
Right.
And then hopefully that's going to translate to the audience as well.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you mentioned that, the idea of clarity. We were talking about The Apartment on another episode. And
Tune in.
And that was one of the things that I realized I wanted to talk about, but I forgot about it. But it's I often get into arguments with a lot of my friends about
Wait, you?
Yeah, I know. I know what a good film is. But that was one of the things watching The Apartment I realized, you know what it is that movie had such clarity as to who the character, or what the character's intent was.
Yeah.
All the characters, you knew exactly what each one of those people wanted. And I feel like clarity has become something that we've become a lost art in filmmaking. Often I find that the filmmaker now sees the audience as an opponent that they're trying to outwit.
Yeah.
And it's like, no, you're telling them a story. You're there to like engage them, not necessarily like outsmart them.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. I've been doing a lot of editing and production on videos that are aimed at a very young demographic, aimed at junior high kids. And one of the things that I've realized in this process is that if you're going to do something on green screen or something, you need to, at some point, show the artifice. Sometimes you have to just, you have to say, yes, we're shooting on green screen. Here, we're going to show you a behind the scenes thing where you see it, you actually see the green screen, because we have become such savvy consumers of media. We've become much more, people know the box office now. They know, all these things. And that, I think, is where that antagonism comes from, is because it's a much more educated consumer. It doesn't mean that you have to be obtuse. It doesn't mean that you have to make something that's hard to understand storytelling-wise. But I get it now, because it's also that it used to be when I told people I was an editor, their first reaction was they thought I was a writing editor. Mm-hmm. And then, you kept explaining, but it took a long time for my folks even to understand exactly what I did. Now, when I say I'm an editor, people get it. Right. And many of them may have done something. They may have taken something and put it up on YouTube, and they begin to understand it. There's part of post-production there's a lot of education that has to happen about understanding how long it takes to do a certain thing. And that is a big part of my job, is just making sure that the expectations are set of like, to make this, we're going to need this amount of time.
Right. Yeah. I think that's something that's often sort of surprising to people. Yeah. It's like, but it's only 2 minutes long. Yeah. How long could it take? Doesn't it just take 2 minutes to put it together?
Exactly.
Well, speaking a little bit to something you mentioned there before, is that I think when you ask someone what an editor does, they think you cut out the bad parts. Right. But it's so much more than that.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not just cutting out the bad parts. It's finding... The thing I'm always amazed by is that the difference that shifting something or adding an additional 2 frames or something just to catch the direction of some eyes, or to catch a slight glimmer of a smile, that can convey so much about your intent and where you're trying to go to, or what you're trying to get across. So it's cutting out the bad parts, but then it's mining it for that gold, those little nuggets. And if you string enough of those little nuggets together, it's almost like a little Pac-Man game. You're trying to lay out the nuggets, at a certain pacing, so that, it's like, okay, I got one, I got another one, so that people will just go, I'm getting fed these at this pace, and I'm used to this, and if I go a long time, it better be a big nugget, Right. So a film is made 3 times. It's written, it's shot, and it's edited, and if the editor was just taking out the bad parts and just crunching them together in an accordion kind of thing, then everybody would be doing it. But what elevates it to an art form and to being a craftsperson is that you find a way to find new things that weren't written or that weren't shot, and you find new ways to convey more to the story.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I think also kind of along those lines too is like, again, we mentioned it in the Carlito's Way episode, the idea of not showing something. Yeah. And kind of taking 2 shots, juxtaposing them together, and letting you fill in the gap. Yeah. You brought up a great example in that episode about comic strips.
Mm-hmm. Comic strips, I mean, it's funny. I'm in my 40s, but I still read the comic strips every morning. And part of that has gotten more fun because I have a 2.5-year-old and I'm reading to him. But I also read them because it's always a lesson in... Between those 3 panels, in between each one of those panels, there is a leap of logic that the cartoonist is asking us to make. Right. And what they leave out is left to the audience, and when you empower the audience to use their imagination, people will support what they help create. And the more that you, instead of having that antagonistic relationship with the audience, the more that you enable them to be your partner in it, and you're sitting along and they're riding shotgun with you. They're not in the back seat. They're not strapped to the hood. They're with you, and you get them to make those leaps of logic And like the example that I was mentioning about a sex scene where you see a couple walking down the hallway and going behind the bedroom door, and then you see that sliver of light underneath the bedroom door, and then you hear a giggle, and then the light goes out, and then you cut to them at breakfast the next morning, and that's we all know what happened,
right?
But you can still keep your PG rating,
right?
And so it's really empowering to give the audience that ability to kind of go like, oh, that was they love each other so much, that must have been an incredible sex scene, but we never saw it.
Yeah.
We just made the leap of logic.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny. I was having a conversation the other night with somebody about ambiguous endings. I feel like oftentimes there are people who love or hate ambiguous endings. I'm neutral.
Yeah.
But I feel like when an ambiguous ending works, it's only because the information we've been given up to that point has been very clear.
Yeah.
And so it's like, okay, when a person gets to a fork in the road, you have to know where those two roads go. And I feel like oftentimes we're just sort of like, who knows where it'll go?
Yeah.
But I think for it to really work, you kind of need to know, well, if you go down this path, these are some of the perils that you may face. If you go down that path, those are some of the perils you might face. And I think that sort of applies to the comic panel idea. Because if it's just a random drawing of someone in a farmhouse and a random drawing of a dog walking down the street, then it's like, well, what's the third path?
Right.
It could be anything.
Yeah. Well, and that juxtaposition, I mean, that's one of the oldest things in editing. You're a student of film, so you know the Kuleshov effect. But the Kuleshov effect is named after Lev Kuleshov, who did this he was a Russian experimental filmmaker who did this experiment where he took a picture of a man, and then the next shot was a shot of food. And then there was a picture of the same man, and then a shot of a little girl who was, I think, ill or something like that, maybe had died. And then the third one was the same man and a picture of a beautiful woman. And so the audience, they said, oh, he's so hungry.
Right.
Oh, he's mourning. Oh, he's lustful. And all these things, what ended up, the thing he pointed out after the experiment was that the shot of the man was always the same shot.
Right. And it was a neutral expression.
Neutral expression.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so it's by what you put next to it that causes reactions to be put on or feelings to be put on the footage on either side of it.
Yeah, that's it's if you've never seen those, because a lot of film history books certainly will have those set out in a series to demonstrate that. And it's a really fascinating thing to take a look at. And speaking of hunger, we got to pay our bills around here.
Nice.
See? I do get better at these.
Set up and hit.
Yes. Our sponsors today are Hilliard's Beer and Scarecrow Video. Hilliard's Beer is brewed and canned in Seattle's Ballard neighborhood, but drunk everywhere. Visit their taproom Thursday through Sunday. You can get more info on them at hilliardsbeer.com. Scarecrow Video is one of the largest independent video stores in the country, located in Seattle's beautiful University District. One of the last remaining brick-and-mortar stores featuring DVDs, VHS, Laserdisc, and Blu-ray. If you can't find a movie at Scarecrow, it hasn't been filmed yet. For more info, visit scarecrowvideo.com.
The Mecca.
Yes, exactly. So, who's some of your influences?
Boy. Well, as I was saying, I think, in an earlier podcast, a lot of my idols are the female editors. Dee Dee Allen, Thelma Schoonemaker, Ann V. Coates. They have adapted so well. Well, and Walter Murch is, of course, sort of the granddaddy for all editors. And Walter Murch has had more effect on editing than anybody else, I think, in film history. He wrote a book called In the Blink of an Eye, and he came up with a formula with these percentages that seem sort of arbitrary a little bit, but they're still they make sense of what motivates a cut.
Right.
And the one thing that, the percentage that sticks out is that 51%, the motivation for a cut is emotion.
Right.
And I think that is very valid, that there are things that you'll be, watching, and there may not be, the eye line might not match, or there might be some, continuity thing. And sometimes I will make a cut just because the emotion is right, the energy is right, there's a gut feeling, and I know that I might be making a continuity problem. Like every time I see these things where like, on IMDb about, continuity problems where like,
right.
well, the cup was in this hand and it was in this hand in the other shot. And my first reaction is like, how much time do you have?
Right.
And great that you have that detail. I mean, you have that ability to, but at the same time, it's like, were you still compelled by the scene? I'm willing to bet you that the editor made the decision because it was the absolutely best take from that actress.
Right.
And
chances are, if you are noticing that stuff, maybe the movie itself is not working.
Exactly. Exactly. You're distracted, and yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, but I also, what I love about some of these old school editors is that they had to make the transition from being on these moviolas and these, cut and splice by hand type editing to the digital revolution, the nonlinear editing that we are in now, where you have multiple options. And a lot of people were kind of saying, oh God, this old guard, they're not gonna cut it. They're not gonna be able to make this transition. And I don't know more than Walter Murch's experience how well they did with getting computer savvy and all that stuff. Because now, an editor is not only just an editor; he is an IT guy. He is as an audio engineer. He's a graphics guy. He's sometimes a scratch VO guy. He's a compressionist. There's all these hats you have to wear. But the great thing about these guys, when they made that switch, they were not only still great editors, but they were better editors because, yes, they had all those options, but that thought process of like, okay, if I'm going to make this splice here, they went through that thing like, for me to do that, that's going to take me 5 minutes to splice that, tape that, do all the stuff. If I'm off by a frame or off by a second or whatever, then I'm going to have to redo this. I'm going to have to retape this and all this stuff. And so their decision-making process was so good. And I think what happens now when I teach editing, boy, it's always it's an interesting thing. Like when I was teaching a full 8-week course, when we got into effects, that's when I lost my students to a certain degree, and I had to rein them back in because then all their cuts had, all these crazy dissolves and all these crazy, things like, because they were doing effects for effects' sake.
Star wipe.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, star wipe. That's to you, Casey Chen. Yeah. But it's interesting that they would just do all these things and they didn't understand why they were doing it. Mm-hmm. They just wanted to play with all the tools. And now, like I mentioned in an earlier podcast, collect them all.
If you get them all, you get a free one.
Bonus. So when they were doing all, these, now that you have all these tools that are available, it's sometimes becomes like a bloated, when Microsoft was putting out, versions of Word that was like, and Haiku Builder, and it's like there were some things, all right, I don't need all these things, I just need a straightforward, thing. But sometimes that amount of tools can be too many options, can lead to paralysis, too many decisions. And so what was great about these old guys is that they basically, they had that decision-making process down cold.
Right.
And they just had to adapt to the technology.
Yeah.
And that's why one of my favorite editors was, Ann V. Coates, who did Lawrence of Arabia and then did Out of Sight later on. And I think that's a marvelously edited film. I think Steven Soderbergh in general has worked with some amazing editors and brought some great things out of him. The Limey is another great edited film and all that stuff. But that's not 20 years ago yet.
Not yet.
Yes. Bring me back.
Hopefully it'll get there. Yeah. I don't know what that means. Okay, so you mentioned this before, but there are basically 3 storytellers on every movie. There's the screenwriter who writes the script and tells the story in pre-production. Then the director tells the story during production. And then the editor tells the final version of the story during post. Yeah. That's a lot of responsibility. Yeah. Elaborate on that, please.
Well, the smart directors, I think, are the ones that take advantage of having a fresh pair of eyes. Yeah. Because, they have, if they get through the process of basically sort of nurturing a script through pre-production and then through, what are often just, laborious, shooting and all this stuff, they should just, I think, and this is obviously my bias here speaking, but they should just, take a little powder, take a little break, rest up a little bit, and let the editor look at things with their fresh eyes and see what stands out, because it'll often be surprising to director what takes were good on set and what takes really read, as we say, in post. And oftentimes, what reads goes back to that Kuleshov effect. It goes back to what's juxtaposed next to it. What is the shot before, or where we're going with it. And like I said, there are so many things where there are things that were not written into the script, but that, like when we were talking about Carlito's Way, was the actor that was playing the mobster, was he, with the cough and everything, was that something he just brought to the character on?
Right.
That was great, and that I thought brought vulnerability to that scene. So, everybody, the thing that I guess in general that is so fascinating about filmmaking is that other than any other art form, I don't know of anyone that is as collaborative as this. If you're a sculptor, you work alone.
Yeah.
If you're a writer, you generally work alone.
Right.
If you're painter, you work alone. But if you're making a film, and unless you're somebody like Kubrick, or unless you're somebody who has just got such a massive vision and you have a very specific way of how it's got to be, most films now, and especially in the Seattle market, in the Seattle film community, you've got such geniuses like, Lynn Shelton and Megan Griffiths, who, there's a lot of collaboration, and they build teams that live off that collaboration. Right. You've got to be open to that, what somebody else brings to it. There's a great quote that came out, and maybe this is sort of another point, but I think it's a point about art after the fact, art after it's been done. And Joss Whedon said it, where he said, you don't own your art. Your art is like your children. It grows up and it talks back to you. People take ownership of it. I don't think that Gene Roddenberry ever expected that there would be Trekkie conventions. Right. I wonder if he ever was alive to see that Trekkie documentary and what he would have thought of it. It's like what do you do when you're you have this vision of what the art is going to be, and then it just gets it gets seen as something else, and so the same thing is true in the making of it, where you have people that go like, yeah, I see where you're going with this, but unfortunately, that's not the way it was shot, or something. I'll have those conversations with the director where I'll go like, I know what the intent was, and we will do our best effort to make all these shots work. But sometimes this scene just doesn't work, and it would be so much cleaner if we just jump to this.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that, because the whole idea of collaboration, I think for a long time when I was directing stuff, I was like, no, I'm going to cut this myself. No one has the vision that I have, this ridiculous attitude. And then when I did my feature, I realized I've lost complete perspective in the editing room. Right. And since then, I've still cut a few things of my own, but I so much more enjoy having somebody else come in and edit now, because it allows me to see something for the first time. Yeah. And there's been so many surprises where I'll walk in and watch something, and there's that instant where I go, oh, that's not supposed to be there.
Right.
But does it work where it is? And you have to kind of divorce yourself of what your intent was and see what the editor has done. And I have found every single time whatever the editor did was now my favorite part. Right. Because it was sort of, maybe it's just because it was new to me and I wasn't expecting it to go in a certain place. But I think that's very difficult to kind of let go of the intent, and absolutely, and that's a tough position for an editor to be in, I think.
Well, and what I often will tell people is that it's like you're having a dinner party, and you've invited me to come cook. So this is your kitchen, it's your food, but I'm going to cook it up, and there's a lot of times where we're just going to be boiling water. We're just going to be, we're going to be grilling, we're going to be heating up the oven and all this stuff. There's some things that you probably don't need to stick around for. But, once we have the stuff out of the oven, once we have things, blanched, parboiled, whatever, come in, taste it, let's add seasoning. But let me cook first. Right. And then we'll see if we're going the right, hopefully it'll still be, a Italian dinner that you want to have and not an Indian dinner. Right. You didn't ask for my salad?
But it tastes better. Speaking of this, obviously it sounds like you feel comfortable taking ownership of a project.
Yeah.
I think that can be difficult sometimes.
I think it goes back to that idea that I mentioned earlier about people will support what they help create. Mm-hmm. You want people to take ownership. You want people to become invested.
Yeah.
On the contrary, man, I've worked with directors that have essentially kind of, after the fact, taken credit for my time, and I don't want to work with them again. The ones that I like working with are the people that understand that, they're coming to me because I have a unique set of skills. I have the technical skills, but I also have, the years of being a storyteller that I'm able to help them, get their vision, but that I'm bringing something fresh to the table, and,
right.
and I'm not just pushing buttons.
Yeah.
And I think that's the quickest way to lose your editor and make him, you want your editor to be invested. The moment that you make him a button pusher, or the moment that, the joke is like you start snapping, and like, I want the cut there, that's just, that's the biggest pet peeve of editors.
Yeah.
So you want people, whatever position they are, whether they're craft service or whatever, you want them to be invested in your project.
Definitely. So how do you keep it fresh? How do you watch something you're working on with a fresh pair of eyes?
Taking time off.
Yeah.
Taking time off from the project. Right now, my projects are so varied that part of it is just like when I'm maybe something is for Microsoft, then another thing is sort of a safety training video, then one is a film that I'm working on. It's the range of and how different they are that helps cleanse the palate. But part of it, especially if you're working on a feature or if you're working on a documentary, is that you have to step away from it and see it with fresh eyes. To be able to see it with fresh eyes. Walter Murch does an interesting thing, two things that I think are great. One is that he edits standing up, as a lot of editors do now. He edits like a gunslinger. He'll just kind of keep his hands at his side, and then as if you're watching along, then he'll just zoom in and just tap a button where he puts a mark in. It's his way of just like going, that speaks to me. And you need to do that because you will, a year down the line, you will forget that first instinct.
Right.
You will forget, that you'll forget that, God, this was really funny at one point.
Right.
And you're going, this is really getting tired. And so it's really hard to keep that original thing. And so not only does he, sort of put those markers and just goes from a, like a sharpshooter type thing, but he also, he writes down his first impressions. And there's a lot of different ways of kind of keeping fresh, but, one thing I'll do sometimes is I will, watch a cut, and then like a day later, I'll just sort of mentally squint my eyes and write down the things I remembered. And I'll go, okay, those things are working.
Right.
Those things are working. These other areas, or if, I can't really describe some section cleanly, I'm going, well, that probably needs to be finessed because it needs to be concise.
Yeah.
I have a good story to tell about how I got into editing.
I was going to ask that.
Okay. Sorry to interrupt. But
No. But please don't let me stop you now.
Well, so how I got into editing was I was working on Real World Seattle. A much maligned, much hated production here in Seattle because I think Seattle was still believing that MTV had killed Kurt Cobain, and so it was a really interesting production to work on. But it was fantastic because all of a sudden I was working for 6 months straight in the film and video industry, and that's unheard of in Seattle. And so I had this gig, and I was like, going, this is crazy, this is great. Well, at the wrap party, we were watching the premiere of the first episode. And there was a scene where the 4 boys in the house were at a bar, and they were at the Phoenix Underground in Pioneer Square. And they were making moves on girls and all this stuff. And I remember being there for that shoot. I remember that day. And then there was inserted a shot of the 4 girls from the house who were at Teeny Biggs, and they were at a bar table, and they were looking on as, and they were making a face, and it was like they were disapproving of the boys macking on the girls. Mm-hmm. And it was something where I was like going, wait a second, that's totally cheating. That was a different bar. That was a different day.
Yeah.
And this guy that I was, this director that I was standing next to, he goes, all editing is cheating. And I was going, wow, that's powerful.
Yeah.
That you can do something like that. And that, that I also, watching that whole season thing that I'd been on, from the entire production, seeing that they had over 2,000 hours that got edited down to 22 hours. So that's a crazy film rating ratio.
Yeah.
And so, what happens in these reality shows is that they look schizophrenic because, they'll have an argument that starts on Tuesday and it might get resolved on Saturday.
Right.
But in reality TV time, that happens in about 10 minutes.
Yeah.
And it just looks like, oh my God, that person's unbalanced,
Right. Yeah.
So it was really enlightening to see that it was that powerful. And so I basically followed the crew back down to L.A. and took a week-long editing course in Avid and bluffed my way in to an online editing position and visual effects supervisor on this show, Making the Video. And the first night that I had to do the online, I was scared shitless because I just did not know what I was doing. And so I had done, everything. I'd figured out most of it. It was 4 a.m. in the morning. At 8 a.m., the outputted cut had to be at the color correction facility and for the sound mix. And I just could not get it to output. I just kept stumbling, and I could not figure it out. And the security guard comes by, and he could just see it was radiating off me in waves that this guy is stressed out and just about ready to have a breakdown. And he goes, "Hey, you okay, dude?" And I said, "Oh." And he goes, "There's a guy down here cutting biorhythms. Maybe he can help you out." And I went down, and guy showed me exactly just one little button that I had not clicked on a thing, and everything worked out fine. And that guy ended up becoming sort of a mentor for me. I'm a big believer that sometimes you just have to fake it till you make it.
Oh, that's this whole business, right?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. Speaking of which, do you have any aspirations to direct?
Well, I have been actually directing and doing more with my company. We've been doing sort of end-to-end production work. It is interesting to step into that directing and producing role. And there are days where I'll spend more than half my day doing contracts and bids and budgets and all these things that...
That's why we get into this bid
business, right? Man, it's a dream come true. Yeah. And you're doing all these things, you're booking all these things, and then it is such a pleasure to step back into editing, and that's when I know that I'm where I'm supposed to be doing, because my dad had a saying that he calls it the 3 a.m. rule. It can be 3 a.m. or 3 p.m. and if you're not looking at your watch, you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. Right. If you're not worried about God, I can't wait till I'm done with this. And that's when I'm editing. I just, I could be doing it all night. And sometimes, that's what, luckily I have, a studio in our house, and, my wife can go, all right, it's time to come up, for dinner. And I'll go, oh, all right, so, but you've got to find that passion that you're not looking at the watch. Yeah. So.
Excellent note to end on. Yeah. Anything you want to say we didn't cover?
Kids stay in school and don't do drugs.
Yeah. Nice. Yeah. Well, thanks again for joining us, Murph. Also known as Tracy Dethlefs. And people can find you on Twitter at?
Trace Editor at TRACEDITOR.
Excellent. Once again, I'd like to thank our sponsors, Honest Tea and Scarecrow Video. If you're a movie lover and would like to support us, you can subscribe to the 2020 Film Club. Your annual subscription gets you into 10 of our monthly for your consideration screenings here in Seattle, plus a ticket to our annual ceremony in February. It's over $100 value for only $40. To enroll, just visit us at 2020awards.org and look for the subscriber link. And remember, until next time, it's never too late to start thinking about the past.